On this video, I am doing a basic introduction to the book of Genesis. We've already talked about the summary of its contents, but now we're going to be looking at the title, the authorship, the date, the historical background, and the purpose. Looking at the title for the book of Genesis takes its name from the Septuagint by way of the Latin Vulgate. In the Septuagint, the words he biblos geneseos are used to set forth the 10 parts that may be used to outline the book. For example, in chapter 2:4, 5:1, 6:9, 10:1, 11:10, 11:27, 25:12, 25 verse 19, and 36 verse 1, and 37 verse 2. In other words, there are 10 parts that seem to tie together the book of Genesis around those passages and what follows. The Hebrew title is Bereshit and may be literally rendered simply in the beginning. The word Genesis means origin or beginning, and this certainly sets forth the contents of the book. A few of the new things or beginnings seen in Genesis are the universe, life, humankind, mankind, the Sabbath, marriage, sin, death, redemption, sacrifice, violence that humans have done, nations, languages, human government, the people of Israel, the covenants, and so forth. So the title aptly fits the contents of the book itself then. Then we have the author. While the book of Genesis nowhere specifically states that Moses was the author, because of internal and external evidence, that is, biblical evidence and external evidence, conservative scholars accept Mosaic authorship for Genesis, as well as the rest of the Pentateuch. The reasons, then, for accepting Mosaic authorship can be stated as follows. Number one, the Pentateuch claims Mosaic authorship in part. For example, in Exodus 17:14, 24:4, 34:27, Numbers 33 verse 2, and Deuteronomy 31:19. Secondly, other portions of the Bible claim Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. For example, Joshua 1:7, in the New Testament, Luke 2:3, and Luke 24:44. And then Christ himself attributed the authorship of the Pentateuch to Moses in John 5:46 to 47, in Matthew 19:8, and in Mark 10:5. And four, Mosaic authorship was held by the ancient Jewish scholars and by the early Christian church up until 1750 AD. This traditional authorship of Moses was not questioned or seriously challenged until the 18th century. The critical view makes the book the product of composite sources which they call J, E, D, and P. It was Wellhausen who brought this hypothesis into prominence, and his hypothesis can be summarized as follows. The earliest parts of the Pentateuch come from two original independent documents, the Jehovahist and the Elohist. From these two, the Jehovahist compiled a work that was principally narrative. In Josiah's time came Deuteronomy, excuse me, and the Deuteronomists incorporated this in the Jehovistic work and revised the whole. The priestly legislation of the Elohim document was largely the work then of Ezra. A later redactor then worked over the whole of all of these so-called sources. The dating for this critical view places the Jehovahist about 850 BC, the Elohist about 750 BC, the combination of J and E in the 7th century BC, with Deuteronomy in 621 BC, and then the addition of P in the Pentateuch around 500 BC. As stated before, this view is diametrically opposed to the evidence of scriptures, both Old and New Testaments, the witness of Christ, the Jewish and early church scholars, and hence, I believe, must be rejected as unhistorical and unauthentic. Concerning the authorship of Genesis, though, even though the events in it antedate Moses, either accurate oral tradition is possible, or the early book of Genesis may have been originally written on tablets by the patriarchs, and then Moses, under divine inspiration, compiled and edited the book. As to the date, the most likely date for Genesis, as well as the rest of the Pentateuch, then, would be after the Exodus, during the wilderness wanderings of Israel. That would place the time of writing approximately 1447 to 1407 BC. As to the historical background, next, the historical setting of Genesis and its writing is during the time of the wandering of Israel in the wilderness, since it was during this time that the book was no doubt penned. While the historical events in Genesis antedate Moses, he no doubt made use of fixed oral tradition or patriarchal writings and composed the book during this period of time. As to the purpose of the book of Genesis is to give a survey of divine revelation from the beginning of creation until the Israelites were brought into Egypt. The major emphasis in the book is laid in the dealing of God with his chosen people, Israel, in chapters 12 to 50. It is through them and the Abrahamic covenant given to Abraham, their father, that God is to develop his entire revelatory program. God's relation to Abraham and the theocratic kingdom program as it relates to him and Israel not only forms the basis of understanding Genesis, but also understanding God's overall revelatory dealings throughout the scriptures. And so in looking at the overall theme of the book of Genesis. It is the book then of beginnings, and it divides naturally into two major sections. The first deals with the beginning of human history from creation to the Tower of Babel, 1:1 to 11:9, and the second section discusses the beginning of Hebrew history, tracing it through the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, chapter 11:10 through 50, through chapter 50. In the first major section, the beginning of human history is set forth, followed then by the specialized history with the patriarchs in chapter 12 and following. So, if I were going to give a brief outline of the book, I would say the beginning of human history is in 1:1 to 11:19, and we have the following events during that period of time: the creation to the fall in chapter 1 to 2, the creation of man recapitulated, humankind, in chapter 2, 4 to the end of chapter 2, the fall to the flood, chapters 3 through 5, and then the flood to the Tower of Babel, chapters 6 through 10. This is then followed by the Tower of Babel, to Abraham, chapter 11, 1 to 9. Following this basic introduction of human history, we have the beginning of Hebrew history. We have the history of Abraham, chapter 12, 1 to 25, 18. This is then followed by the history of Yitzchak or Isaac, chapters 25, 19 to 26, 35. We have then, following that, the history of Jacob, chapter 27, 1 to 36, 43. And lastly, we have the history of Yosef or Joseph, chapter 37, 1 to chapter 50, to the end of chapter 50, verse 26. So in this video, what I'm just simply doing is providing an overview, an introduction to then the book of Genesis, dealing with those themes: title, author, date, historical background, purpose, and a basic summary outline. In another video, I discussed the flow of thought or the basic content of the book of Genesis.